There's nothing quite as humbling as watching greatness fall from grace. But there's also nothing quite as powerful as watching it rise again when no one expects it. In a Detroit gym, heavyweight champion Troy Titan Garrison spotted a homeless man watching from the corner. Eli, 56 and barefoot, wore clothes that had seen better decades. Troy called him into the ring as a joke for his crowd's entertainment. But when Eli stepped through those ropes and threw his first punch, the laughter died. The man, who looked broken on the outside, moved like he remembered something the world had forgotten. Each jab carried the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. What kind of dreams do you have to lose to end up living on the streets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor of Garrison's gym, illuminating dust particles that danced in the amber light like tiny fighters themselves. Troy Titan Garrison stood in the center of his domain, all 6 feet 4 inches of him wrapped in the confidence that came from never having tasted defeat. At 44, his body still carried the power that had demolished 37 professional opponents. But time was a fighter that never lost, and Troy could feel it circling him like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The championship belt that hung in the glass case near the entrance wasn't just leather and gold. It was the weight of expectations, the burden of perfection, and the constant reminder that in boxing, as in life, you're only as good as your last fight. Troy had worn that belt for 6 years, defending it 8 times, and each defense felt heavier than the last. Not because he was getting weaker, but because he was running out of reasons to care about winning. His entourage moved around him like planets orbiting the sun. Marcus, his trainer since the beginning, worked a heavy bag with the steady rhythm of a man who understood that champions were built one punch at a time. Sarah, his publicist, tapped away on her phone, managing the carefully crafted image that kept the endorsement deals flowing. Danny, his manager, counted money with the same precision Troy counted combinations. They were all there because of him. But Troy had never felt more alone. The gym itself told the story of his journey from the streets of Detroit to the pinnacle of heavyweight boxing. Photos lined the walls. Troy as a hungry 20-year-old throwing combinations with desperate fury. Troy raising his hands in victory after his first professional win. Troy accepting the championship belt with tears streaming down his face. But the photo that drew his attention most often was tucked away in the corner. A younger Troy standing next to his father, both wearing matching boxing gloves, both smiling like they believed the world was theirs for the taking. His father had died before seeing Troy win the title. Heart attack at 52. Brought on by a lifetime of working double shifts at the Ford plant to pay for Troy's training. The old man had sacrificed everything for his son's dream, and Troy had achieved it all: the fame, the fortune, the respect. So why did he feel like he was shadowboxing with ghosts? The morning routine was always the same. Arrival at 6, stretching until 6:30, heavy bag work until 7:15. Speed bag until 8, sparring until 9 if he had a partner worthy of his time. But lately, even the routine felt hollow. He went through the motions with the mechanical precision of a man who had forgotten why he started fighting in the first place. "You seem distracted today," Marcus observed, wrapping Troy's hands with the careful attention of a man who had done this ritual thousands of times. Marcus was 63. A former middleweight who never quite had what it took to be great, but possessed the wisdom to help others achieve what he couldn't. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his eyes held concern. "Just thinking about the Morrison fight," Troy replied, though that wasn't entirely true. Kevin Morrison was his next opponent, a decent fighter, but nothing Troy couldn't handle in his sleep. The real distraction was something deeper. A gnawing sense that all his victories had somehow led him to this place of emptiness. The gym filled with its usual cast of characters as the morning progressed. Young fighters with dreams bigger than their bank accounts, aging warriors trying to prove they had one more good fight left in them, trainers who lived vicariously through their charges, and the hangers-on who attached themselves to success like remmers on a shark. They all looked at Troy with a mixture of respect and envy, but none of them really saw him. His relationship with his son David had become another casualty of his success. The boy was 22 now, a man really, but Troy still thought of him as the kid who used to shadow him around the gym, throwing tiny punches at the air and declaring he'd be champion someday too. But David had chosen college over boxing, books over brutality, and their conversations had dwindled to obligatory phone calls on holidays and birthdays. "You raised him right," his ex-wife Linda had said during their last conversation. "He wants to make something of himself that doesn't involve getting hit in the head for a living." The words stung because they carried the implication that Troy's chosen profession was somehow lesser, that the discipline and sacrifice required to reach the top of the boxing world was just elaborate self-destruction. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had everything he'd ever wanted and nothing he actually needed. Money sat in accounts he rarely checked. Cars gathered dust in garages. The mansion in Bloomfield Hills felt more like a museum than a home, filled with trophies and awards that reminded him of his accomplishments but couldn't fill the silence that echoed through empty rooms. Troy's training sessions had become performances rather than preparation. Camera crews showed up regularly, documenting the champion's dedication for promotional materials that would air before his fights. He smiled for the cameras, delivered the sound bites they wanted, played the role of the confident champion who lived for the next battle. But when the cameras stopped rolling, the emptiness returned. The younger fighters in the gym watched him with reverence, studying his technique, trying to decode the secrets of his success. What they didn't understand was that technique could be taught, but the fire that drove a man to greatness couldn't be passed down like family heirlooms. That fire came from hunger, from having something to prove, from fighting not just opponents, but circumstances, poverty, and doubt. Troy had proven everything there was to prove. He'd escaped the streets, provided for his family, achieved fame and financial security. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost the thing that made all the sacrifice worthwhile, the pure joy of fighting, the moment when everything else disappeared. And there was only the perfect rhythm of movement, the chess match of strategy and counter-strategy, the dance between destruction and art. The championship belt in its case caught the afternoon light, gleaming like a golden albatross around his neck. He'd defended it successfully 8 times, but each defense felt less like victory and more like postponing the inevitable. Time was undefeated, and Troy knew that sooner or later, some hungry young fighter would take what he'd worked his entire life to achieve. The question wasn't if, but when, and what he'd be left with when the belt was gone, and the crowd stopped cheering Dodd as the gym emptied in the late afternoon. Troy found himself alone with his thoughts and the rhythmic thud of his gloves against the heavy bag. Each punch was technically perfect, thrown with the precision of a master craftsman, but they lacked the desperate fury that had carried him to the top. He was going through the motions, and in boxing, that was the first sign that the end was near. The photo of him and his father seemed to watch from its corner, a reminder of simpler times when the dream was pure and the goal was clear. His father had believed that boxing was about more than winning fights. It was about proving that a man could overcome anything if he was willing to pay the price. But what happened when the price had been paid and the victory felt hollow? Troy unwrapped his hands slowly, the ritual as familiar as breathing. Tomorrow would bring another day of training, another step toward a fight that felt more like obligation than opportunity. He was the champion, undefeated and unmatched, but he'd never felt more like he was losing the only fight that truly mattered, the one for his own soul. The evening air hung thick with the promise of rain when Eli Thornfield first appeared at the edge of the gym's parking lot. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned that drawing attention was often dangerous, his weathered face scanning the area before stepping into the circle of light cast by the building's windows. Through the glass, he could see the organized chaos of training fighters moving with purpose, trainers calling out instructions, the familiar symphony of leather against leather that had once been the soundtrack to his own dreams. Eli's clothes hung loose on his frame, faded jeans held up by a belt that had seen better decades, a flannel shirt that bore the stains of too many nights spent sleeping rough. His feet were bare, the shoes he'd worn that morning having fallen apart during his walk across the city. But his eyes, those still held the sharp focus of a fighter, even after 15 years of living on society's margins. He pressed his face closer to the window, watching Troy Garrison work the speed bag with mechanical precision. The champion's form was flawless, each strike perfectly timed. But Eli could see what the others missed: the absence of joy, the routine nature of movements that should have been poetry. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself, back when boxing had become obligation rather than passion. The memories came unbidden, as they often did when he watched other fighters train. Eli had been 28 when his world fell apart, ranked 5th in the middleweight division and climbing fast. His trainer, old Pete Martinez, had mapped out a path to the Olympics, then a professional career that could have set him up for life. The future had stretched before him like an open highway, bright with possibility and promise. But that was before the phone call that changed everything. Before the words "car accident" and "critical condition" had shattered his universe into pieces, too small to ever put back together properly. His daughter Emma, 8 years old and full of the same fire that drove her father in the ring, had been hit by a drunk driver while walking home from school. The impact had left her clinging to life in a hospital bed, while Eli faced the most important decision of his career. The Olympic trials were 3 days away. 3 days that represented a lifetime of preparation, sacrifice, and dreams. Pete had begged him to think practically. Anna was stable, the doctors were optimistic, and missing the trials would mean losing everything they'd worked for. "You can't help her by throwing away your future," the old trainer had said, but his words felt like sandpaper against Eli's soul. Eli had chosen boxing. He'd sat beside Emma's hospital bed for one night, holding her small hand and promising he'd be back after he secured their future. She'd smiled at him through the oxygen mask, her eyes bright with the unconditional love that only children possess, and told him she'd watch him fight on television. "Win for me, Daddy," she'd whispered, and he promised he would. The trials had gone perfectly. Eli fought with a desperate intensity that impressed everyone watching, winning his division and earning a spot on the Olympic team. He'd called the hospital immediately after his victory, practically floating with the joy of being able to share the good news with Emma. But the nurse who answered had a different kind of news waiting for him. Emma had died during his final fight. While he was celebrating his victory, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs, his little girl had slipped away quietly, her mother holding one hand while the other reached out for a father who wasn't there. The doctor said it was peaceful, that she'd gone quickly, but Eli knew the truth. She'd died alone when she needed him most. The guilt had consumed him like acid. He'd withdrawn from the Olympic team, unable to face the sport that had cost him everything meaningful in his life. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of grief and recrimination. Sarah, his wife, had never forgiven him for choosing boxing over their daughter's final hours. And honestly, he'd never forgiven himself either. Alcohol had seemed like a reasonable solution at first. It numbed the pain, quieted the voices that reminded him of his failure as a father, made the empty house feel less like a mausoleum of lost dreams. But alcohol demanded its own sacrifices. His savings disappeared, then his house, then his relationships with anyone who might have helped him find his way back to something resembling a life. The streets of Detroit had become his home 15 years ago, and they'd taught him lessons that no boxing gym ever could. He'd learned that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, that survival sometimes meant swallowing dignity, along with whatever charity he could find. He'd slept in doorways and under bridges, weathered winters that tried to freeze the life out of him, and somehow managed to keep breathing when everything inside him wanted to stop. But boxing had never really left him. Late at night, when the city grew quiet and the shadows provided cover, he'd find empty lots or abandoned buildings and practice the combinations that lived in his muscle memory. His body had aged and weakened, but the fundamentals remained: footwork, timing, the ability to see a punch coming and counter before his opponent knew what happened. Watching Troy through the gym window, Eli saw a different kind of emptiness than his own, where Eli had lost everything and been forced to rebuild from nothing. Troy seemed to have achieved everything and discovered it wasn't enough. They were opposite sides of the same broken coin, separated by fortune but united by a kind of spiritual exhaustion that came from fighting too long, without remembering why the fight mattered. The rain started as a light mist, then grew heavier, driving Eli deeper into the shadows outside the gym. He should have left, should have found shelter for the night, but something kept him rooted to that spot. Maybe it was the rhythm of the training inside, the familiar sounds that reminded him of who he used to be. Maybe it was the way Troy moved, with the fluid grace of a master craftsman who'd forgotten the joy of his craft. When the gym's main door opened and Troy emerged with his entourage, Eli instinctively stepped back into the darkness. But not far enough. Troy's sharp eyes caught the movement, the flash of a figure trying to fade into the night. Their gazes met across the parking lot: champion and vagrant, success and failure. Two men whose paths should never have crossed, but somehow had anyway. For a moment, neither moved. Troy's expression was unreadable, calculating, while Eli stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights. The champion's courage hadn't noticed yet, too busy discussing dinner plans and tomorrow's schedule to pay attention to the homeless man lurking in the shadows. Then Troy did something unexpected. Instead of looking away or calling security, he studied Eli with the same intensity he reserved for opponents he was trying to figure out. There was something in the way the older man held himself, something about his posture that spoke of training and discipline despite his obvious circumstances. Troy had spent his entire adult life reading fighters, and this man, homeless, broken, forgotten, still carried himself like someone who'd once known how to fight. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and pregnant with the kind of change that starts with a single decision. Troy's entourage was moving toward their cars, assuming he would follow as he always did. But instead, the champion took a step toward the shadows where Eli waited, drawn by curiosity and perhaps by the recognition that they shared something deeper than their obvious differences. When Troy finally spoke, his voice carried across the rain-dampened parking lot with surprising gentleness. "You're welcome to come inside," he said, loud enough for Eli to hear but quiet enough that his team remained oblivious. "It's going to be a cold night." Eli's throat worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. "I don't have any money," he said, the words rough from disuse and honesty. Troy's smile was sad and knowing. "Neither did I, once upon a time." He gestured toward the gym's entrance. "Come on, I think we might have something to talk about." That invitation, offered on a rainy evening outside a Detroit boxing gym, would change both their lives in ways neither man could have imagined. As Eli followed Troy back toward the light, his torn boxing gloves carried in a plastic bag for 15 years like relics of a former life pressed against his side, still holding the shape of hands that remembered what it felt like to be great. The fluorescent lights of the gym felt harsh after the soft darkness outside, casting everything in sharp relief that made the contrast between Troy's polished world and Eli's weathered existence even more pronounced. Troy's entourage had dispersed for the evening, leaving the two men alone in the vast space that suddenly felt intimate despite its size. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of rain against the windows. Troy moved with the practiced ease of someone completely at home in his environment, gathering towels and checking equipment with the automatic gestures of routine. But his eyes kept returning to Eli, who stood near the entrance as if ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. There was something about the way the older man positioned himself that spoke of tactical awareness, back to the wall, clear line of sight to the exit, weight balanced on the balls of his feet despite his bare feet and obvious exhaustion. "You can sit down," Troy offered, gesturing toward the bench near the ring. "Or shower if you want. There's a locker room in the back with clean towels." Eli shook his head slowly, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who'd learned not to assume charity came without strings. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to impose. You've already done more than enough by letting me in out of the rain." The formality of his speech surprised Troy. Despite his appearance, Eli spoke with the measured cadence of someone educated, someone who'd once moved in different circles than the streets that currently claimed him. It was another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit with assumptions. Another reminder that the stories people carried weren't always written on their faces. Marcus emerged from the back office, stopping short when he saw their unexpected guest. The old trainer's eyes narrowed as he took in Eli's appearance, his protective instincts for Troy warring with natural compassion. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone neutral but watchful. "Marcus, this is—" Troy paused, realizing he didn't even know the man's name. "Eli," the homeless man supplied quietly. "Eli Thornfield." Marcus's reaction was subtle but immediate, a slight widening of his eyes, a catch in his breath that suggested recognition. The old trainer had been around boxing long enough to know most of the names that mattered, and while he couldn't quite place this particular one, something about it tickled the edges of his memory. "Thornfield," Marcus repeated slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "You ever fight professionally?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Eli's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped enough to reveal the pain beneath. "A long time ago," he said finally. "Different life." Troy found himself studying Eli with new interest. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see the signs, the way the man's shoulders held themselves despite his obvious fatigue, the unconscious shifting of weight that spoke of ingrained defensive habits, the quick, economical movements that suggested a body that remembered training, even if it had been years since that training was put to use. "What division?" Troy asked, genuine curiosity replacing the casual charity that had brought them together. "Middleweight," Eli answered, then added with something that might have been pride, "I was ranked 5th when I retired." Marcus's breath caught audibly this time, and he moved closer, his trainer's eye now openly assessing the man standing before them. "Wait, Eli Thornfield, the southpaw with the granite chin? You were supposed to make the Olympic team." The recognition hit Eli like a physical blow, and Troy watched emotions play across his weathered features: pride, pain, regret, and something darker that might have been self-loathing. "I made the team," Eli said quietly. "I just didn't go." The confession settled over the gym like dust, heavy with implications and unspoken tragedy. Marcus stepped closer, his trainer's instincts overriding his caution as he began to circle. Eli with the evaluating gaze of someone who'd spent decades identifying talent and potential. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. "I remember watching you fight Rodriguez in Chicago. You dropped him 3 times before they stopped it." He turned to Troy, excitement building in his voice. This man was special. Lightning fast, hit like a truck, could take a punch that would put most men in the hospital. Troy felt something shift in his chest, a stirring of interest he hadn't experienced in years. Here was a genuine mystery, a puzzle that went deeper than simple curiosity about how a former top-ranked fighter ended up living on the streets. "What happened?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be complicated and painful. Eli's smile was bitter and broken. "I made the wrong choice at the wrong time, and everything good in my life paid the price." He looked around the gym, taking in the photos of Troy's victories, the championship belt gleaming in its case, the evidence of a career still ascending while his own had crashed and burned. "But that's ancient history. I should go." "Wait," Troy said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. Something about Eli's story, about the obvious pain and regret that radiated from him like heat, had awakened something in Troy that had been dormant for years. "Marcus, you said he was good?" "Good?" Marcus laughed, but it wasn't humor that colored his voice. "Son, this man was potentially great. If he'd gone to the Olympics, hell, if he just kept fighting professionally, we might be talking about him in the same breath as some of the legends." The weight of lost potential settled over them like a shroud. Troy understood something about that weight, though his own burden was different, not the regret of dreams abandoned, but the hollow victory of dreams achieved without bringing the satisfaction they'd promised. "Show me," Troy said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. Both Marcus and Eli stared at him. "Show you what?" Eli asked. "Show me what made you special. Get in the ring with me." The suggestion hung in the air like a dare. Marcus looked alarmed, clearly thinking about insurance policies and liability and all the practical reasons why letting a homeless man spar with a heavyweight champion was a terrible idea. But Troy was already moving toward the equipment closet, pulling out gloves and headgear with the purposeful energy of someone who just found something he didn't know he'd been looking for. "I can't," Eli protested, but his eyes had locked onto the boxing gloves in Troy's hands with an intensity that spoke of hunger long suppressed. "I haven't trained in years. I'm not in shape. I'd embarrass myself." "Maybe," Troy agreed, holding out a pair of gloves. "Or maybe you'd remember something you thought you'd lost." Eli stared at the gloves as if they were both salvation and damnation, his hands scarred from street fights and hardship, but still carrying the telltale calluses of someone who'd once lived in gyms trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the leather. "Just light sparring," Troy said gently. "Nothing serious." "I'm curious, that's all." Marcus was shaking his head, muttering about lawsuits and common sense, but Troy wasn't listening. He was watching Eli's face, seeing the war between fear and desire play out in the older man's features. This was about more than curiosity. Now it was about giving someone a chance to reclaim a piece of themselves they thought was gone forever. When Eli finally took the gloves, his touch was reverent, the gesture of a man handling sacred relics. "It's been 15 years, he said, but he was already moving toward the ring, his body remembering rhythms and routines that had once defined his existence. "Muscle memory's a funny thing," Troy replied, following him toward the squared circle that had been the site of his greatest triumphs. "Some things you never really forget." As they approached the ring, an old yellowed newspaper clipping caught Troy's eye, one of Marcus's collection of boxing memorabilia that covered one wall of the gym. It showed a younger Eli, arms raised in victory, with the headline, "Thornfield dominates in Olympic qualifier." The photo showed a man in his prime, confident and powerful, a stark contrast to the weathered figure now climbing through the ropes. But as Eli stepped into the ring and began to move, something remarkable happened. The years seemed to fall away like shed skin, revealing glimpses of the fighter he'd once been. His stance shifted automatically into the classic southpaw position, his weight distributed perfectly, his hands rising into the defensive posture. that had once protected him from the hardest punchers in his division. Troy felt his pulse quicken with an anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was about to face something unpredictable. Something that couldn't be solved with superior conditioning and technical perfection. He was about to step into the ring with a genuine mystery, and the prospect filled him with an energy he'd thought was gone forever. The transformation that overcame Eli as he settled into his fighting stance was nothing short of remarkable. The stooped posture of defeat straightened into the coiled alertness of a predator, his bare feet finding their balance on the canvas with the instinctive precision of muscle memory that ran deeper than conscious thought. The weathered face that had carried the weight of 15 years on the streets now showed the focused intensity that had once made him one of the most feared middleweights in the amateur ranks. Troy circled slowly, his heavyweight frame moving with the fluid grace that had made him a champion. But something felt different about this encounter. Not the calculated aggression of a title defense, nor the routine dominance of a training session with lesser opponents. This felt like discovery, like opening a book whose pages had been sealed for decades. "Hands up," Marcus called from ringside, his trainer's instincts overriding his concerns about the wisdom of this impromptu sparring session. "And Ella, remember, you're a southpaw. Make him work to get inside." The reminder seemed unnecessary. As soon as Troy stepped forward to test Eli's defenses, the older man's left hand snapped out in a quick jab that caught the champion square. On the nose, not hard enough to hurt, but sharp enough to get his attention. Troy blinked in surprise, not at the contact itself, but at the speed and accuracy of the punch. For someone who claimed to be out of practice, Eli's timing was remarkably sharp. "Not bad," Troy admitted, touching his nose and finding it dry. "But let's see what you've got when I start moving." What followed was unlike any sparring session Troy had experienced in years. Instead of the predictable patterns, he'd grown accustomed to younger fighters trying to prove themselves through aggression. Veteran sparring partners who knew their role was to provide work without real challenge. Eli fought with the cunning, intelligence of someone who'd learned to survive by being smarter than his opponents rather than stronger. Every time Troy pressed forward, Eli wasn't quite where the champion expected him to be. The older man slipped punches with minimal movement, wasting no energy on unnecessary dramatics, instead relying on subtle shifts in angle and timing that made Troy's powerful shots whistle past empty air. It was boxing stripped down to its essential elements: geometry and physics, action and reaction. The chess match between two minds trying to solve the puzzle of their opponent. "Jesus," Marcus breathed from ringside, his eyes wide with professional appreciation. "He hasn't lost it. Different body, same brain." Troy found himself working harder than he had in months, not because Eli was overpowering him, but because the older man refused to be overwhelmed. Where Troy expected to find openings, he found defensive positioning that forced him to think, to adjust, to actually problem solve in real time rather than rely on superior attributes to dominate. When Eli countered with a left hook that grazed Troy's temple, the champion felt something he hadn't experienced in years: surprise. Not the manufactured drama of promotional events or the scripted challenge of carefully selected opponents, but genuine uncertainty about what would happen next. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Troy asked during a break, both men breathing hard, but neither showing signs of wanting to stop. Eli smiled for the first time since entering the gym, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Detroit Golden Gloves program," he said, his voice carrying a note of pride that hadn't been there before. "Started when I was 12. My father worked at the steel plant and thought boxing might keep me out of trouble." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Boxing had ultimately led Eli to the greatest trouble of his life, but it had also given him something that 15 years of hardship hadn't been able to take away. In the ring, he was still himself in a way that seemed impossible anywhere else. As they resumed sparring, Troy found himself studying his opponent with the analytical mind that had made him a champion. Eli's footwork was still excellent despite his bare feet and obvious lack of recent training. His defensive positioning was textbook perfect, and his counters came at unexpected angles that suggested he'd been taught by someone who understood boxing as both art and science. "Tell me about your trainer," Troy said, slipping under a left hand and answering with a body shot that Eli absorbed without backing up. "Pete Martinez," Eli replied, stepping to his right and flicking out another jab. "He trained 3 Olympians and 2 world champions. I had the best natural timing he'd ever seen." Marcus's head snapped up at the name. Pete Martinez, the old Cuban, that man was a genius. He looked at Eli with new respect. If Pete Martinez said you had timing, that means something. The conversation continued between exchanges, punctuated by the sharp snap of gloves on gloves and the rhythmic shuffle of feet on canvas. Troy learned that Eli had turned professional at 19, compiled a record of 23-1 with 16 knockouts, and was being groomed for a title shot when tragedy derailed his career. The details came slowly, each revelation painting a picture of a man who'd had everything: talent, opportunity, a future bright with promise, and lost it all in a single moment of poor judgment. "What happened to Pete?" Troy asked, genuinely curious about the man who'd shaped such an impressive fighter. Eli's face darkened, and his next combination carried more force than necessary. "He tried to help me after everything fell apart. Offered to train me again, said we could rebuild. But I was too far gone by then. Too angry, too drunk, too broken." He paused, his guard dropping slightly. "I blamed him for pushing me to choose boxing over my daughter. It wasn't fair, but fair doesn't matter when you're drowning." The admission hung between them like a bridge, not just information shared, but trust offered. Troy realized that this was the first time in years someone had spoken to him without an agenda, without trying to get something from him or tell him what he wanted to hear. Eli's honesty was brutal and complete, carrying the weight of someone who'd lost so much that pretense had become a luxury he couldn't afford. As their impromptu session continued, Troy noticed something else. He was enjoying himself. The tactical challenge of facing an opponent he couldn't simply overpower, the mental stimulation of adapting to Eli's unorthodox style, the pure joy of boxing for its own sake, rather than for cameras or contracts or the expectations of others. This felt like the sport he'd fallen in love with as a young man, before fame and money had complicated everything. When they finally stopped, both men were breathing hard and grinning despite themselves. Eli's transformation was complete. The broken homeless man was gone, replaced by someone who carried himself with the quiet confidence of a true fighter. The change was so dramatic that Troy found himself wondering which version was real, or if perhaps they both were different aspects of the same complex human being. Troy began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Educational? Surprising? The first time in years he'd felt truly challenged. All of those things were true, but none of them captured the feeling of having touched something authentic in a world that had grown increasingly artificial. "Different," Eli supplied, understanding intuitively what Troy was struggling to express. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be good at something again." Marcus was shaking his head in amazement as he helped them out of their gloves. "In all my years training fighters, I'd never seen anything like that. You two have completely different styles, different sizes, different everything, but somehow it worked. It was like watching a conversation in a language only fighters understand." As they cleaned up, Troy found himself studying Eli with new eyes. The homeless man who'd appeared outside his gym was still there. But now Troy could see the layers beneath: the fighter who'd once been great, the father who'd made an impossible choice, the man who'd paid a price so high it had nearly destroyed him but somehow hadn't quite succeeded. In his pocket, Eli still carried the faded hospital bracelet from his daughter's final stay, a piece of plastic and paper that had become both talisman and torture device, a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. He touched it unconsciously as they talked, the gesture automatic and protective, as if contact with that small piece of his past could somehow bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. Troy noticed the gesture and found himself wondering what weight he carried, what invisible burdens had shaped his own path to this moment. Success, it seemed, created its own kind of prison, just as complete as the one that failure had built around Eli. The difference was that Troy's walls were gilded, making them harder to see and therefore harder to escape. The morning after their impromptu sparring session found Troy arriving at the gym earlier than usual, driven by a restless energy he couldn't quite name. He'd slept fitfully, his dreams filled with images of movement and counter-movement, of facing an opponent who fought with intelligence rather than brute force. The encounter with Eli had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years: curiosity, genuine interest in another human being's story, and perhaps most surprisingly, humility. Eli was already there, sitting on the front steps of the gym with the patient stillness of someone who'd learned to wait without complaint. He wore the same clothes as the night before, but they seemed somehow less ragged in the morning light, as if his transformation in the ring had carried over into how he carried himself in the world. When he saw Troy approaching, he stood with fluid grace that spoke of muscles remembering their purpose. "Couldn't sleep either?" Troy asked, unlocking the gym's front door. "Sleep's a luxury when you don't have a bed," Eli replied, but there was no self-pity in his voice, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement of his circumstances. "I wanted to thank you for last night. It's been a long time since I felt like myself." Troy pushed open the door and gestured for Eli to follow him inside. "Which self is that? The fighter or the—" "They're the same person," Eli interrupted gently. "I just forgot for a while." The gym felt different in the early morning quiet, more intimate somehow without the usual bustle of trainers and fighters. Troy moved through his routine preparations, but his mind kept returning to the previous evening's revelations. Here was a man who'd achieved something Troy was chasing: genuine greatness, the kind that came from pure talent developed through perfect training, and then lost it all through a single moment of choosing duty over love. "Tell me about your daughter," Troy said suddenly, the words surprising them both. Eli's hands stilled where he'd been rewrapping his torn gloves, the ones he'd carried for 15 years, like relics of a former life. For a long moment, Troy thought he'd overstepped, pushed too hard into territory that was still too raw to explore. But then Eli reached into his pocket and withdrew a water-damaged photograph, handling it with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. The picture showed a little girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, arms wrapped around the neck of a younger, healthier version of Eli. They were both wearing boxing gloves, hers comically oversized, his perfectly fitted, and the joy on both their faces was so pure it made Troy's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Emma," Eli said simply. "She was 8 when this was taken. Smart as a whip, funny as hell, and tougher than most grown men I knew. She used to come to the gym with me sometimes, shadowboxing in the corner while I trained. Pete said she had natural balance, that she could be whatever she wanted to be." Troy studied the photograph, seeing in the little girl's eyes the same intelligent intensity he'd witnessed in Ela's during their sparring session. "She looks like she had your spirit." "Better," Eli said, his voice thick with memory and loss. "She had her mother's heart and my stubbornness, which meant she never gave up on anything, including me, even when she should have." The admission opened a door that Troy found himself walking through without conscious decision. "I have a son," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth because he so rarely talked about David with anyone. 22 years old, and his Final year at University of Michigan. Pre-med. Smart kid, always was. But, Eli prompted, recognizing the weight of unfinished thoughts. But we haven't really talked in 2 years. Oh, we exchanged the obligatory phone calls on holidays, text messages on birthdays, that sort of thing. But actually talked. About anything that matters? Not since he told me he thought boxing was barbaric and couldn't understand why I'd chosen to make a living by hurting people. Eli was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing the edge of Emma's photograph. How old was he when your career really took off? 14 when I won the title. Perfect age to be embarrassed by everything your father does. Troy's laugh was bitter. I thought I was building something for him, you know? Financial security, a legacy he could be proud of. Turns out all I was building was a wall between us. The price of dreams, Eli murmured, and Troy understood that. He was speaking from painful experience. We tell ourselves we're sacrificing for them, but sometimes what we're really doing is sacrificing them for us. The observation hit Troy like a physical blow because it carried the ring of absolute truth. How many of David's school events had he missed for training camps? How many family dinners had been rescheduled around promotional obligations? How many times had he justified his absence by pointing to the bank account that would secure David's future, without considering that what his son might have wanted was simply his father's presence? Emma never got the chance to hate me for my choices, Eli continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She died believing I was a hero, that boxing made me special. It's taken me 15 years to realize that might have been the cruelest cut. Of all that, she never lived long enough to be disappointed in me. Troy found himself studying Eli's face, seeing in the weathered features the same kind of regret he'd been carrying without acknowledging. They were different men who'd made different choices, but both had discovered that success in the ring could coexist with failure in the parts of life that actually mattered. What was it like? Troy asked quietly, having to choose between her and the Olympics? Eli closed his eyes, and Troy could see him living through the memory again, like being asked to choose between breathing and living. The Olympics represented everything I'd worked for, everything my father had sacrificed for, everything Pete had invested in me. But Emma was my heart walking around outside my body. The rational choice was obvious. She was stable. The doctors were optimistic. The Olympics only came around every 4 years. But it wasn't really a choice, was it? No, Eli admitted. It was a test, and I failed it completely. I chose the dream over the dreamer, the future over the present, the possibility of glory over the certainty of love. And the universe made... Sure, I understood exactly what that choice cost. Troy felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. Here was someone who'd paid the ultimate price for the kind of single-minded focus that boxing demanded. And in his story, Troy could see the shadows of his own choices, his own failures, his own mounting regrets. Marcus arrived to find him sitting in comfortable silence, the shared weight of their respective losses creating a bond that neither had expected but both desperately needed. The old trainer took one look at their faces and understood that something had changed overnight, that the chance encounter of the previous evening had evolved into something more significant. You two look like you've been to confession, Marcus observed, his tone gentle but knowing. Something like that, Troy replied, and for the first time in years, the words carried no artifice, no performance, just simple honesty between men who'd found something valuable in their shared BROKENNESS. As the gym filled with its usual morning energy, Troy found himself watching Eli with new understanding. The homeless man was still there, the worn clothes, the bare feet, the careful wariness that came from years of surviving on society's margins. But now Troy could see the father who'd loved his daughter more than life itself, the fighter who'd been great before tragedy taught him the true cost of greatness. The man who'd spent 15 years punishing himself for a choice that had seemed impossible at the time and unbearable in retrospect. The water-damaged photograph went back into Eli's pocket, but its image remained burned in Troy's memory. A reminder that every choice carried a price, and that sometimes the victories that mattered most happened outside the ring. In the quiet moments when love proved more important than ambition, it was a lesson Troy was only beginning to understand, but one that might not be too late to learn. The partnership that developed between Troy and Eli over the following weeks defied every conventional wisdom about professional boxing. Champions didn't train with homeless men. Undefeated fighters didn't seek wisdom from those who'd lost everything. But in the quiet hours before the gym opened to its usual clientele, something remarkable was taking place. Two broken men were teaching each other how to heal. Eli's presence had become a fixture in Troy's routine, arriving each morning before dawn and waiting with patient dignity until Troy unlocked the doors. He never asked for anything beyond the opportunity to train, never imposed on Troy's generosity, but his mere presence had begun to change the entire atmosphere of the gym. Where once there had been the mechanical precision of routine, now there was something that felt more like purpose. The yellowed Olympic training schedule that Eli carried in his pocket had become a bridge between their two worlds. The document, preserved despite 15 years of rough living, outlined the regimen that had once prepared him for the highest levels of competition. As Troy studied the methodical progression of exercises, the careful balance of skill development and conditioning, he began to understand that Eli's approach to boxing had been fundamentally different from his own. "Look at this," Troy said one morning, pointing to a section of the training plan that detailed mental preparation techniques. "You spent as much time on psychological conditioning as physical training." Eli nodded, adjusting the hand wraps he borrowed from the gym's spare equipment. Pete believed that boxing was 90% mental once you reached a certain level of skill. He said the body could only be pushed so far, but the mind could transcend physical limitations if you trained it properly. It was a revelation that challenged everything Troy thought he knew about his sport. His own training had always focused on physical supremacy, strength, speed, endurance, technique. The mental aspect had been largely ignored, assumed to be something that would develop naturally through experience. But watching Eli move, seeing how his 46-year-old body could still compete with Troy's superior conditioning through pure intelligence and ringcraft, Troy began to understand what he'd been missing. Their training sessions had evolved into something that resembled therapy more than athletic preparation. Eli's questions were probing but gentle, designed to make Troy think about not just how he fought, but why he fought. The older man had a way of drawing out confessions that Troy had never shared with anyone, creating a safe space where the champion could acknowledge doubts and fears that had no place in his public persona. "When did you stop enjoying it?" Eli asked one afternoon as they worked on defensive positioning. His question came out of nowhere, but Troy understood immediately what it meant. "I'm not sure I ever really enjoyed it," Troy admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. "I mean, I loved winning, loved the respect and the money and the recognition, but the actual fighting, it always felt more like work than play, even when I was young and hungry." Eli absorbed this information with the thoughtful attention of someone who'd learned to listen beneath surface meanings. "Emma used to ask me why I looked so serious when I trained. She said it looked like I was mad at the heavy bag, like it had done something to hurt my feelings." The memory brought a smile to both their faces, but it also highlighted the contrast between their relationships with boxing, where Eli had fought with passion that bordered on fury, driven by circumstances and the desperate need to escape his situation. Troy had approached the sport with calculated ambition, seeing it as a vehicle for achievement rather than an expression of his essential self. "Maybe that's why you were better than me," Troy said, though he immediately regretted the words for their self-pity. "No," Eli corrected firmly. You achieved everything I dreamed of achieving. The difference is that you did it without losing. The things that mattered most. Your son is alive, Troy. Your relationship with him might be strained, but it exists. That means there's still time to fix what's broken." The observation stung because it carried implications Troy wasn't ready to face. If David was still alive, if their relationship could potentially be repaired, then every day Troy chose boxing over reconciliation was another day he was repeating Eli's fundamental mistake. The parallel was uncomfortable but undeniable. Word of their unusual partnership had begun to spread through Detroit's tight-knit boxing community. Other trainers stopped by to watch their sessions, drawn by curiosity about the homeless man who could make a heavyweight champion work harder than any sparring partner in years. The attention made Troy's management team nervous. Insurance liability, potential public relations problems, the risk of association with someone whose story might not reflect well on the champion's carefully crafted image. Danny, Troy's manager, had pulled him aside after one particularly intense training session. "Look, I get that you're trying to help the guy, and that's admirable. But people are starting to ask questions. What happens when the media finds out you're training with a homeless man? How does that look to the sponsors?" The question revealed everything that was wrong with Troy's world. The assumption that appearance mattered more than substance. That association with society's forgotten could somehow diminish rather than elevate a person's character. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had led Troy to his current state of spiritual emptiness. The belief that success was measured by distance from failure rather than proximity to authentic human experience. "Maybe it looks like I'm finally learning something worth knowing," Troy had replied. But the conversation planted seeds of doubt that he couldn't entirely dismiss. His career was built on more than just his ability to fight. It was a carefully constructed brand that generated millions of dollars for a lot of people. Did he have the right to risk that for a friendship that most people would never understand? Eli seemed to sense Troy's internal struggle without needing explanation. "I know what people are saying," he said during one of their quiet conversations after training, "about you taking a risk by being seen with someone like me, about what it might cost you professionally." "It doesn't matter what people say," Troy replied, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "It does matter," Eli corrected gently, "because this world you've built, these people who depend on you, they're real. You have responsibilities that I threw away 15 years ago. The difference is that you still have choices to make." The wisdom in Eli's words was both comforting and challenging. Here was someone who'd lost everything, offering perspective on how to avoid making the same mistakes. But the advice came with the implicit acknowledgement that every choice carried a price. Troy could continue his association with Eli and risk professional consequences, or he could step back and preserve his career at the cost of a friendship that had become genuinely meaningful. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to learn from Eli's mistake of choosing boxing over family, Troy was facing his own version of the same impossible decision. The specifics were different, but the fundamental tension remained. How do you honor your responsibilities to others while staying true to your own moral compass? As their training continued, Troy began to understand that Eli's greatest gift wasn't his boxing knowledge or his tragic story, but his ability to ask the questions that mattered. Questions about purpose, about legacy, about what it meant to be successful in ways that couldn't be measured by championship belts or bank account balances. "What do you want people to remember about you when you're gone?" Eli asked one evening. As they cleaned up after training, Troy had never considered the question seriously before, but as he thought about it, he realized that most people would remember him for his undefeated record, his highlight reel knockouts, his dominance of the heavyweight division. They would remember the fighter, but would they remember the man? And more importantly, would the people who mattered most, his son, his family, The community that had shaped him, remember him as someone who'd used his platform for something meaningful? The Olympic training schedule in Eli's pocket had become more than just a historical document. It was a reminder that dreams achieved through sacrifice were only meaningful if the sacrifice served a purpose larger than personal ambition. Eli's tragedy wasn't just that he'd lost his daughter, but that he'd lost her in service of a dream that ultimately meant nothing without her there to share it. Troy was beginning to understand that his own dreams might be headed toward the same hollow victory unless he found a way to reconnect them to the things that actually mattered. The question was whether he had the courage to make the changes that understanding demanded, or whether he would continue down the path of comfortable success until it was too late to choose differently. The discovery came by accident, as the most profound revelations often do. Maria Santos, the social worker who'd been quietly observing the unlikely friendship between Troy and Eli, had been researching resources for other homeless individuals when she stumbled across medical records that had been misfiled years earlier. What she found changed everything they thought they knew about Eli's story, and more importantly, about the choice that had haunted him for 15 years. She arrived at the gym on a Thursday evening, her face carrying the weight of someone who'd uncovered a truth too important to ignore. Troy and Eli were finishing their usual session, moving through combinations with the fluid rhythm they'd developed over weeks of training together. The sight of them champion and vagrant's success and failure still struck visitors as incongruous, but Maria had learned to see beyond surface appearances. "I need to show you something," she said without preamble, clutching a manila folder against her chest like armor. "Both of you, it's about Emma." Eli's face went ashen at his daughter's name, his carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under sudden pressure. In all their conversations, in all the stories he'd shared about his past, Emma remained the wound too deep to fully explore. Troy moved instinctively closer, recognizing the signs of someone about to face their deepest pain. "What kind of something?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria opened the folder with trembling fingers, revealing photocopied pages of medical records, hospital admission forms, and treatment notes that dated back 15 years. "I was looking for information about available medical services for homeless individuals, and I found these in a misfiled section of county records. They're from Children's Hospital, from Emma's final admission." Troy watched Eli's hand shake as he reached for the documents, saw the man who'd faced professional fighters. Without flinching, now terrified of pieces of paper that might rewrite his understanding of the worst moment of his life. The medical records were dense with technical language and abbreviations, but certain details stood out with devastating clarity. "I don't understand," Eli said, scanning the pages with growing confusion. "These dates, they don't match what I remember. It says here that Emma was admitted on March 15th, but the Olympic trials were March 18th through 20th. I thought she'd been in the hospital for weeks before I left." Maria nodded, her expression gentle but insistent. "Keep reading. Look at the timeline." As Eli studied the documents more carefully, the color drained from his face entirely. According to the medical records, Emma hadn't been critically injured weeks before the Olympic trials. She'd been hit by the drunk driver on March 5th and 3 days before the trials began, and had died on March 19th, during the final day of competition. But more shocking still were the notes about her condition during those crucial days. "Stable but critical," Eli read aloud, his voice cracking with emotion, responsive to treatment. Family advised the patient was fighting hard and showing positive signs of recovery. He looked up at Maria with eyes that held the beginning of understanding and the birth of a different kind of anguish. "They told me she was stable. They told me the surgery went well and that her vital signs were strong." Troy felt his own chest tighten as the implications became clear. "You didn't abandon a dying child to chase a dream," he said quietly. "You made a rational decision based on the medical information you had at the time. But Eli was still reading, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Jesus Christ, he breathed. Look at this notation from March 18th. Patient asking repeatedly for father. Emotional distress when told he's competing out of state. Recommend family contact to provide reassurance. The words hit like physical blows. Emma hadn't just been stable during the trials, she'd been conscious, aware, asking for the father who'd chosen to chase his Olympic dream because he'd been told she was going to be fine. The tragedy wasn't that Eli had abandoned a dying child, but that he'd missed the last coherent days of his daughter's life based on medical advice that had proven catastrophically wrong. There's more, Maria said softly, pointing to a section of notes from the night Emma died. The attending physician wrote that her condition deteriorated rapidly and unexpectedly. Massive internal bleeding that hadn't been detected earlier. By the time they realized how serious it was too late to contact family. Troy watched 15 years of guilt and self-recrimination crumble in real time as Eli processed the true sequence of events. The story he'd told himself, that he'd chosen boxing over his dying daughter, was only partially true. He had chosen boxing, but based on information that suggested Emma would recover. That missing the trials would mean sacrificing everything for a few extra days of sitting beside a hospital bed while his daughter got better. They called me after she died, Eli whispered, his voice hollow with shock. I was celebrating my victory, posing for pictures, talking to reporters about making the Olympic team. And while I was accepting congratulations, my little girl was... He couldn't finish the sentence. She was fighting for her life, Maria completed gently. And according to these notes, she fought hard. The doctors say she was incredibly brave, that she kept asking the nurses to call you to tell you she was proud of you for making the team. The revelation should have provided relief, absolution from 15 years of crushing guilt. Instead, it seemed to multiply Eli's anguish. The narrative that had sustained him through his darkest years, that he was a selfish father who'd chosen ambition over love, was being replaced by something more complex and somehow more painful. He'd made a reasonable choice based on incomplete information, but that didn't change the fact that Emma had died while he was elsewhere, that her final days had been spent asking for a father who wasn't there. Troy found himself thinking about his own son, about all the times he'd justified his absence with rational explanations, important fights, crucial training camps, promotional obligations that couldn't be missed. How many times had David asked for his father while Troy was somewhere else, building a career that was supposed to benefit them both? I still chose wrong, Eli said finally, his voice carrying a different kind of pain now. Maybe I had good reasons, maybe the doctors gave me bad information, but I still chose boxing over being with her. The fact that she wasn't dying yet doesn't change the fact that I wasn't there when she needed me most. No, Troy said firmly, surprising himself with the vehemence of his response. You chose based on the best information you had. You thought you were being responsible, making sure your future was secure, so you could take care of her for the rest of her life. The tragedy isn't that you made the wrong choice. It's that life doesn't give us enough information to make the right ones. The medical records spread between them like evidence in a trial that had been ongoing for 15 years, finally providing testimony that complicated the verdict Eli had rendered against himself. But truth, Troy was learning, wasn't always liberating. Sometimes it was just another burden to carry, another layer of complexity in an already impossible situation. What do I do with this? Eli asked, gesturing at the documents that had rewritten his understanding of the defining moment of his life. How do I live with knowing that maybe I wasn't the monster I thought I was, but I still lost everything that mattered? The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications that extended far beyond Eli's personal tragedy. Troy understood that this moment was about more than correcting historical facts. It was about whether redemption was possible, when the sins you'd been punishing yourself for weren't exactly the sins you'd actually committed. You live with it the same way you've been living with everything else, Troy said finally. One day at a time, trying to do better with the information you have now than you did with the information you had then. As they sat in the quiet of the empty gym, surrounded by the tools of a trade that had both elevated and destroyed them, Troy realized that Eli's story was everyone's story in one way or another. Everyone carried guilt about choices made with incomplete information. Everyone wondered what might have been different if they'd known then what they knew now. The difference was that most people didn't have to carry the weight of such profound consequences. The medical records would change Eli's understanding of his past, but they couldn't change the past itself. Emma was still gone. 15 years were still lost. And the man who'd once been destined for Olympic glory was still sitting barefoot in a Detroit gym, trying to make sense of a life that had taken turns no one could have predicted. But perhaps that was the real lesson buried in those misfiled documents. Not that Eli was innocent of the charges he'd brought against himself, but that the line between guilt and innocence was more complex than he'd ever imagined. And maybe, just maybe, that complexity left room for the possibility of forgiveness, even if it had to come from within. The weeks following the revelation about Emma's medical records marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between Troy and Eli. Where once their training sessions had been driven by mutual curiosity and the simple pleasure of skilled competition, they now carried the weight of something larger, a shared understanding that boxing could be more than sport, more than entertainment, more than individual achievement. The handwritten training schedule that emerged from their collaboration reflected this evolution. Unlike the mechanical precision of Troy's previous preparation routines or the desperate intensity of Eli's Olympic-era regimen, this new plan balanced physical conditioning with emotional preparation, technical refinement with psychological healing. Each day's work was designed not just to improve their boxing, but to address the deeper wounds that had brought them together. "Look at this," Troy said one morning, reviewing the schedule they'd developed together. Tuesday, heavy bag work followed by discussion of purpose. Thursday, sparring followed by meditation on legacy. Saturday, conditioning followed by letters to family. He looked up at Eli with something approaching wonder. "I've never trained like this before." Pete used to say that you can't separate the fighter from the man, Eli replied, adjusting the hand wraps that had become as much ritual as necessity. "If the man is broken, the fighter will be too, no matter how technically perfect his form might be." The decision to transform their private training sessions into a public exhibition had grown organically from the conversations that followed their workouts. Troy's upcoming fight with Kevin Morrison, originally conceived as another routine title defense against an overmatched challenger, had become something else entirely under Eli's influence. Instead of simply defending his belt, Troy wanted to use the platform to demonstrate something about redemption, about second chances, about the possibility of finding meaning in loss. "I want you in my corner," Troy had said one evening as they finished their training. "Not as a curiosity, not as a publicity stunt, but as my chief second. I want people to see what I see when I look at you." Eli's response had been immediate and firm. "I'm not going to be your pet homeless man, Troy. I won't be paraded around as evidence of your charity or used to make you look good to the cameras. That's not what this is about," Troy insisted, though he understood Eli's wariness. "This is about showing people that greatness doesn't always look the way they expect it to. That wisdom doesn't always come wrapped in success. That maybe the man everyone wants to write off has something to teach the man everyone wants to celebrate." The negotiation that followed revealed the complexity of their relationship. Troy's team, his manager, his publicist, his promotional company saw potential in the story, but wanted to control its narrative. They envisioned a feel-good tale of the champion helping the homeless, complete with before and after photos, carefully scripted testimonials about Troy's generosity and character. Eli would have none of it. "If I'm going to be part of this," he said during a tense meeting with Troy's management team, "it's going to be on terms that respect both of us. I'm not going to pretend that Troy saved me, because the truth is that we saved each other. And I'm not going to let anyone turn my daughter's death into a promotional opportunity." The final agreement they reached was unprecedented in professional boxing. Eli would serve as an assistant trainer, working with Troy in full view of the media and the public, but with complete editorial control over how his story was told. Any interviews would be conducted jointly. Any promotional materials would require his approval, and the focus would remain on boxing rather than on the personal tragedies that had brought them together. The response from the boxing community was immediate and polarized. Traditional purists questioned whether a homeless man with no recent training experience belonged in a champion's corner. Progressive voices celebrated Troy's willingness to challenge conventional wisdom about who could contribute to a fighter's preparation. The media, predictably, focused on the human interest angle while largely missing the deeper implications of what Troy and Eli were trying to demonstrate. "This is either brilliant or insane," Marcus observed during one of their strategy sessions, "maybe both." As the fight approached, Troy found himself training with an intensity and focus he hadn't experienced in years. But unlike the grim determination that had characterized his previous camps, this preparation felt joyful, purposeful, connected to something larger than personal achievement. Eli's presence had transformed the gym from a place of mechanical repetition into a laboratory for exploring the intersection of physical excellence and spiritual growth. The reconciliation with his son David began tentatively through phone calls that gradually extended from the obligatory check-ins. Troy had grown accustomed to interreal conversations about meaningful subjects. Inspired by Eli's story about the importance of presence over achievement, Troy had started sharing his own struggles with the pressure of maintaining perfection, his fears about aging, his growing understanding that success without connection was ultimately hollow. "I never knew you thought about stuff like that," David had said during one of their longer conversations. "I always figured you had everything figured out, that winning was enough to make you happy." "I thought so too," Troy admitted. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things. The breakthrough came when David asked if he could attend the Morrison fight, not as the champion's son fulfilling family obligations, but as someone genuinely curious about what his father was trying to accomplish. "This homeless guy you're training with," David said. "Mom told me about him, about his daughter. It sounds like you're learning something important." The simple acknowledgement that his journey toward understanding might have value meant more to Troy than any victory he'd achieved in the ring. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building something worth his son's respect, rather than simply accumulating achievements that impressed strangers. Eli's own preparation took different forms. His physical conditioning, impressive. For a man his age who'd lived rough for 15 years, continued to improve under structured training. But more importantly, he seemed to be finding peace with the revelations about Emma's death. The guilt that had driven him to the streets hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more manageable. An understanding that good people could make reasonable decisions that led to tragic outcomes without being defined entirely by those tragedies. "I'm not trying to get my life back," he explained to Troy during one of their evening conversations. "That life is gone, and maybe it needed to be. But I am trying to build something new from the pieces that are left." The training schedule they developed together became a roadmap for that reconstruction. Physical conditioning to reclaim his body from years of neglect. Technical work to refresh skills that had been dormant but not forgotten. Mental preparation to face the possibility of being seen, judged, and potentially rejected by a world that, had written him off long ago. But perhaps most importantly, emotional work to process not just the tragedy of Emma's death, but the wasted years that had followed. 15 years of self-imposed exile, of refusing help, of choosing destruction over healing because he believed he deserved nothing better. The medical records hadn't absolved him of responsibility for those choices, but they had provided context that made forgiveness of himself and others at least theoretically possible. As fight night approached, Troy realized that the outcome in the ring had become almost secondary to the larger statement they were making about redemption, about the possibility of finding meaning in loss, about the ways that two broken people could help each other heal. Win or lose against Morrison, he would step out of the ring as a different man than he'd been when he stepped in, more aware of what mattered, more connected to his purpose, more grateful for the unexpected friendship that had changed his understanding of what it meant to be successful. The handwritten training schedule, now worn from constant reference and revision, had become more than a plan for physical preparation. It was a blueprint for transformation, a daily reminder that growth was possible especially when it seemed like all the important chances had already been missed. In teaching Eli to fight again, Troy had learned what it meant to live again. In helping Troy rediscover his purpose, Eli had found his own path back to something resembling peace. The fight with Morrison would be many things: a title defense, a public spectacle, a test of skill and strategy. But more than anything else, it would be a celebration of the idea that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, even if that person looks nothing like the one you thought you were supposed to become. The sound of the opening bell echoed through the packed arena like a call to judgment, reverberating off the walls and settling into the bones of 20,000 spectators who had come expecting a routine title defense, but sensed they were about to witness something unprecedented. That bell, the same bronze instrument that had marked the beginning and end of countless battles in this historic venue, now rang with the weight of transformation, calling two men not just to fight, but to demonstrate what redemption could look like when witnessed by the world. Troy, Titan Garrison, stood in his corner, but the man who stepped through the ropes to face Kevin Morrison bore little resemblance to the mechanically perfect champion who had dominated the heavyweight division. For 6 years, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Where once Troy had entered the ring with the cold confidence of a man who viewed opponents as obstacles to be efficiently removed, tonight he carried himself with something warmer purpose that went beyond personal achievement, connection to something larger than individual glory. In his corner, Eli Thornfield sat on a stool that might as well have been a throne, his presence transforming what should have been a mismatch into something approaching a morality play. The crowd's reaction to Eli had been everything Troy's management team had feared and more. Catcalls about bringing hobos to a title fight, mixed with genuine curiosity about the mystery man who had somehow earned a place in the champion's corner. Television commentators struggled to explain his presence without sensationalizing his story, walking the fine line between human interest and exploitation that Eli had insisted upon in his media agreements. Morrison, a capable but unremarkable fighter whose primary qualification for this shot was his willingness to take it on short notice, seemed genuinely confused by the circus atmosphere that had developed around what should have been a straightforward business transaction. He was here to collect a payday and hopefully survive long enough to earn future opportunities, not to participate in whatever psychological drama was playing out between Troy and his unusual corner team. But as the fighters touched gloves in the center of the ring, Morrison caught Troy's eyes and saw something that made him recalibrate his expectations for the evening. This wasn't the board champion going through the motions that his team had prepared him to face. This was a man fighting for something that mattered, and that made him exponentially more dangerous. The first round unfolded with Troy establishing his dominance through technical superiority rather than brute force. His jab was crisp and purposeful, his footwork fluid and economical, his defensive positioning textbook perfect. But there was something different about his approach, less mechanical repetition and more creative problem-solving, as if he was seeing the sport through fresh eyes that found new possibilities in familiar situations. Between rounds, Eli's presence in the corner created a dynamic unlike anything Troy had experienced before. Where his previous corner teams had focused on technical adjustments and tactical observations, Eli spoke to him about staying connected to his purpose, about fighting with intelligence rather than anger, about remembering that the real victory lay not in defeating Morrison, but in demonstrating something meaningful about redemption and possibility. "You're boxing like you remember why you started," Eli said, his voice calm but intense as he worked on Troy's mouthpiece. "Keep that feeling. Don't let the crowd or the cameras make you forget what this is really about." The observation was perceptive and accurate. Troy did feel like he was remembering something fundamental about boxing that he'd lost somewhere along the path to championship success. The sport wasn't just about winning fights. It was about testing yourself against worthy opponents, about pushing beyond your perceived limitations, about finding grace under pressure and beauty in the midst of controlled violence. Morrison, to his credit, was providing exactly the kind of test that made Troy's rediscovered love of boxing meaningful. The challenger was skilled enough to demand Troy's full attention, durable enough to absorb punishment without folding, and hungry enough to keep pressing forward even when clearly outmatched. He was, in other words, everything Troy needed him to make this night about more than simple dominance. As the middle rounds progressed, Troy found himself fighting with a fluidity and creativity that surprised even his most experienced observers. Combinations flowed together with artistic precision, defensive movements became studies in economy and efficiency, and his ring generalship reached levels that suggested he was operating on a plane above his previous performances. The crowd, initially skeptical about the circus atmosphere surrounding the fight, began to recognize that they were watching something special. This wasn't just a champion defending his title. This was a master craftsman demonstrating his art at its highest level, inspired by forces that transcended mere athletic competition. The moment came in the 8th round, when boxing transcended sport and became something approaching art. Morrison, showing the heart of a true warrior despite being clearly outmatched, caught Troy with a solid right hand that snapped the champion's head back and brought the crowd to its feet. For a split second, Troy felt the familiar surge of anger that had fueled so many of his previous victories, the desire to punish, to dominate, to make his opponent pay for the presumption of landing a clean shot. But then he heard Eli's voice, cutting through the noise of the crowd, calm and clear and centered. "Stay present. This is about more than winning." The words worked like a reset button on Troy's entire approach to the fight. Instead of responding with the devastating combinations that would have put Morrison down hard and fast, Troy stepped back, smiled at his opponent with genuine respect, and nodded in acknowledgement of the shot that had landed. It was a gesture so unexpected, so contrary to boxing convention, that the arena fell into confused silence. Morrison himself seemed stunned by the response. He'd landed his best punch on the champion and received not retaliation but recognition. Moment of sportsmanship so pure that it transformed the nature of their encounter from battle to dance, from competition to collaboration in the creation of something beautiful. What followed was perhaps the finest 3 minutes of boxing Troy had ever produced. Not because of the damage he inflicted or the dominance he displayed, but because of the way he fought with precision, intelligence, and a kind of compassionate artistry that honored both his own skills and his opponent's courage. Each combination was delivered with just enough force to demonstrate mastery without unnecessary punishment. Each defensive movement flowed into offensive opportunity with the grace of a master. Musician interpreting a complex score. The bloodied hand raps that. Covered Troy's fists had become symbols of something larger than their practical purpose. Where once they had been simply tools for protection, tonight they represented the bond between two men who had found healing in mutual recognition of their brokenness. Eli had wrapped those hands with the same care he'd once shown when preparing for his own fights, and Troy could feel that connection with every punch he threw. "That's it," Eli called from the corner as Troy slipped a Morrison jab and countered with a picture-perfect uppercut that lifted the challenger onto his toes without putting him down. "You're not fighting against him. You're fighting with him. Teaching all of us." The observation crystallized something Troy had been feeling but couldn't articulate. This wasn't about defeating Morrison. It was about demonstrating what boxing could be when practiced by someone who understood its deeper purposes. Every exchange was a lesson in the sport's possibilities, every round a chapter in a story about redemption that went far beyond the outcome of a single fight. Morrison, bleeding from cuts above both eyes, but still pressing forward with admirable determination, seemed to understand that he was participating in something larger than a title fight. His punches carried less desperation and more purpose, as if he too had been transformed by the strange alchemy of this unusual evening. When he landed, Troy acknowledged it. When Troy returned fire, Morrison absorbed it with the dignity of someone who knew he was contributing to something meaningful. The crowd had evolved along with the fighters. What had begun as bloodthirsty anticipation of violence had transformed into appreciation for artistry, for the display of skills refined to their highest level and deployed with wisdom rather than mere aggression. They were witnessing not just a boxing match, but a masterclass in what human potential could accomplish when guided by purpose rather than simply ambition. In the 9th round, Troy felt the moment when winning became less important than the manner of winning. Morrison was hurt, his legs unsteady and his guard dropping with exhaustion. But he continued to fight with the heart of someone who refused to quit. Troy could have ended it with a single decisive combination, could have put an exclamation point on his dominance that would have satisfied the crowd's desire for spectacle. Instead, he chose something more difficult and ultimately more meaningful. He fought the final rounds with the restraint of someone who understood that true strength sometimes meant pulling back rather than pressing forward, that the greatest victories were often the most subtle ones. "Last round," Eli said as Troy sat on the stool before the 10th and final frame. "Win it clean. Show them what a champion looks like when he remembers his responsibility to the sport." The final 3 minutes became a celebration of everything boxing could be at its best. Troy dominated without destroying, controlled without cruelty, demonstrated mastery without malice. Morrison, exhausted but unbroken, continued to engage with the courage that had brought him this far, earning respect with every punch he threw and every shot he absorbed. When the final bell rang, both men met in the center of the ring with an embrace that spoke to something deeper than mere sportsmanship. They had participated together in the creation of something rare and beautiful, a fight that elevated everyone who witnessed it, that demonstrated the sport's capacity for grace under pressure and art in the midst of violence. The decision was unanimous and never in doubt, but the score seemed almost beside the point. Troy had retained his championship, but more importantly, he had redefined what championship could mean. This wasn't just about being the best fighter in the world. It was about using that platform to demonstrate something meaningful about human potential, about the possibility of finding purpose in struggle, about the way that two broken men could help each other become whole. As Troy raised his arms in victory, his eyes found Eli in the corner, and the look they shared contained more satisfaction than any of his previous triumphs had provided. They had done more than win a fight. They had proven something about redemption, about second chances, about the transformative power of unexpected friendship. The bloodied hand wraps that Eli carefully removed from Troy's hands would be preserved. not as trophies of victory, but as reminders of connection, evidence that the most meaningful battles were often fought not against opponents but alongside them, in service of something larger than individual achievement. In that moment, as the arena erupted in applause for a performance that had transcended sport and approached art, both men understood that they had found what they'd been searching for, without knowing they were looking for it. Proof that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be, even if that person looked nothing like the one you thought you were supposed to become. 6 months after the Morrison fight, the transformed landscape of Garrison's gym bore little resemblance to the sterile training facility it had once been. Where corporate sponsors' logos had once decorated the walls, community photographs now told stories of second chances and renewed hope. The championship belt still gleamed in its case, but it was no longer the centerpiece of the space. That honor belonged to a simple memorial plaque that read, "In memory of Emma Thornfield and all those lost along the way, may their dreams live on in the dreams of others." Troy stood before that plaque each morning, not in mourning but in recognition of the responsibility that came with understanding. Ella had insisted on the memorial, not as a shrine to grief, but as a reminder that every person who walked through the gym's doors carried stories of loss and hope, dreams deferred and possibilities yet to be discovered. It had become the spiritual center of what they were building together, a place where boxing served purposes larger than individual achievement. Changes extended far beyond decoration. The gym now operated as much as community center as training facility, offering programs that address not just physical conditioning, but mental health, addiction recovery, job training, and family reunification. Eli had become the program's heart and soul, his own journey from the streets to redemption, serving as both inspiration and practical roadmap for others facing similar struggles. "Tell me again why you think this will work," Troy had asked during the early planning stages, when the scope of their vision seemed overwhelming and the logistics impossibly complex. "Because everyone deserves what you gave me," Eli had replied. "Simply, a chance to remember who they used to be and figure out who they might become." The program's success had surprised even its most optimistic supporters. Men and women who had given up on themselves found purpose in the structured challenge of boxing training. Former addicts discovered that the discipline required for athletic improvement translated directly to other areas of life. Homeless individuals learned that they possessed skills and strength they'd forgotten they had. And that recognition became the foundation for rebuilding lives that had seemed beyond repair. Troy's own relationship with boxing had been fundamentally altered by the experience. Where once training had been a solitary pursuit focused on maintaining his edge over potential challengers, now it became a shared exploration of human potential. He sparred not just with professional fighters, but with recovering addicts learning to channel their anger productively, with homeless veterans rediscovering their sense of purpose, with young people from the neighborhood learning that discipline could be a form of self-respect. "You fight differently now," David observed during one of his regular visits to the gym. Troy's relationship with his son had been transformed along with everything else, built on the foundation of honesty and vulnerability that Eli had helped him discover. "It's like you're teaching instead of just winning." The observation was accurate and insightful. Troy had begun to understand that his greatest victories would be measured not by the opponents he defeated, but by the lives he helped transform. Each person who found their way back from the margins of society became a testament to the possibility of redemption, a living argument against the idea that some people were beyond help. Eli's role in the community had evolved organically from his work with Troy. His official title was Director of Outreach Services, but his real function was harder to define: part counselor, part trainer, part wise elder who understood the landscape of loss and recovery from personal experience. He had an uncanny ability to see through the defensive postures that people adopted to protect their wounded hearts, to recognize the fighter hidden beneath layers of hurt and disappointment. "I know what it's like to believe you're finished," he would tell newcomers to the program. "I spent 15 years thinking my life was over because I'd made one terrible choice. But here's what I learned: you're not defined by your worst moment, and it's never too late to write a better ending to your story." The impact extended beyond the individuals directly served by the program. Word of what was happening at Garrison's gym had spread throughout Detroit's struggling communities, creating ripple effects that multiplied the good being done. Other gyms had adopted similar models. Social service agencies had redirected resources toward programs that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. And the city government had begun to recognize that investment in comprehensive rehabilitation programs produced better outcomes than traditional approaches to homelessness and addiction. Troy's professional boxing career had taken on new dimensions as well. He continued to fight and win, but now each victory served purposes beyond personal achievement. Prize money was donated to expand the community programs. Media attention was leveraged to raise awareness about social issues, and his platform as champion became a voice for those who had previously been voiceless. The memorial plaque had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for program participants and community members. Parents brought children to learn about the importance of being present for family. Recovering addicts touched Emma's name as a reminder that their choices affected more than just themselves. Veterans found comfort in knowing that their struggles were acknowledged and their service honored. But perhaps the most frequent visitor was Eli himself, who came to the memorial not in sorrow but in gratitude. The revelation about Emma's medical records had not erased his grief or eliminated his regrets, but it had transformed his guilt into something more manageable and ultimately more productive. He had learned to carry his daughter's memory as inspiration rather than burden, to honor her life by helping others avoid the kind of despair that had consumed him for so many years. "I talk to her sometimes," Eli admitted to Troy during one of their quiet conversations after the gym had closed. "Tell her about the people we're helping, the lives that are changing. I like to think she's proud of what we've built here." "I think she is too," Troy replied, and meant it. The little girl in the water-damaged photograph had possessed the same generous spirit that now motivated their work. The same belief in the possibility of good outcomes, even in difficult circumstances. As the first anniversary of their meeting approached, both men reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this point. Troy had found the meaning and purpose that success alone had never provided. Eli had discovered that redemption was possible even after the most devastating losses. Together, they had created something that transcended their individual stories, a living demonstration that broken people could help each other heal, that second chances were not just possible but necessary, that the most important victories happened not in the ring but in the quiet moments when someone decided to try again. The championship belt still mattered, but it had been transformed from an end in itself into a means of serving others. Troy's undefeated record remained intact, but more importantly, he had learned to define victory in terms that had nothing to do with win-loss statistics and everything to do with the number of lives touched, the amount of hope restored, the degree to which suffering had been transformed into service. The memorial plaque would remain long after both men were gone, a reminder that love could survive loss, that purpose could emerge from pain, and that sometimes the most profound changes began with the simple decision to see dignity in places where others saw only despair. Emma's dream of having a father who was present when it mattered most had finally been fulfilled, not in the way anyone could have predicted, but in the way that mattered most through the transformation of grief into grace, of regret into redemption, of two broken men into healers of a broken world.